In April 1917, inside the most exclusive hotel in Paris, a 22-year-old British prince sat down for lunch and fell completely under the spell of a woman the palace would have burned to the ground to keep secret. She was a courtesan, a professional seductress, and within weeks he was writing her letters so explicit that they could have destroyed the British monarchy overnight. But Marguerite Alibert was only the beginning. Before Wallis Simpson ever entered the picture, the future King Edward VIII left a trail of scandal, heartbreak, and forbidden American love affairs that stretched from the trenches of France to the glittering mansions of Hollywood. 4 women, 3 decades, 1 devastating pattern. This is the story they tried to bury. To understand how the Golden Prince of the British Empire became the most reckless royal lover in modern history, we need to go back to where it all began, with a lonely boy locked inside a palace. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David was born on June 23, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond, Surrey. He was given 7 names. He would spend his entire life trying to escape every single one of them. As the eldest son of the Duke and Duchess of York, the future King George V and Queen Mary, Edward was heir to the most powerful throne on earth. The British Empire at the turn of the 20th century spanned a quarter of the globe. It controlled territories from India to Africa to the Caribbean to the Pacific. And the boy who would one day lead all of it could not, as a child, get his own father to say something kind to him. George V was not a cruel man by the standards of his time, but by any modern measure, he was a cold, rigid, emotionally withholding parent. He ran his household like a naval ship, which, given his years in the Royal Navy, was perhaps inevitable. Mealtimes were silent, displays of affection were non-existent. When Edward made mistakes, he was criticized sharply and publicly. When he succeeded, the praise was minimal. George V once reportedly told a courtier, "My father was frightened of his mother. I was frightened of my father. And I am damn well going to see to it that my children are frightened of me." Edward's mother, Queen Mary, was a different kind of absence. She was intelligent, cultured, and deeply devoted to the institution of the monarchy. But she was emotionally remote. She loved her children in the way that Edwardian upper-class mothers often did, from a distance, through servants, through schedules. Hugs were rare, bedtime stories were rarer. The result was a boy who was desperate, almost pathologically desperate, for affection, for warmth, for the feeling that someone, somewhere truly wanted him. Not the Prince of Wales, not the heir to the throne, just David. Just the small, shy, boyishly handsome man who felt completely invisible inside his own palace. He was educated by private tutors and then sent to the Royal Naval College at Osborne at 13, and later to Magdalen College, Oxford. He was slightly built, good-looking in a delicate way, and possessed of a charm that was entirely natural. He genuinely liked people, which made him almost unique among the senior royals of his era. But beneath the charm was an insecurity so deep it would shape every relationship he ever had. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Edward begged to be sent to the front lines. The military refused. He was the heir to the throne, far too valuable to risk in the trenches. Instead, he was assigned staff positions behind the lines in France. He hated it. He felt like a fraud. He wanted to fight alongside ordinary men, to prove that he was more than a title and a tailored uniform. He wrote to his father, begging to be allowed closer to the action. The answer was always no. But the war gave him something else, something his father never intended and the palace never anticipated. It gave him freedom. Specifically, it gave him Paris. Paris during the Great War was a strange and contradictory place. Just miles away, soldiers bled and died in the mud of Flanders and the Somme. But behind the lines, the city's hotels, restaurants, and private salons hummed with a desperate, feverish kind of glamour. Officers on leave drank champagne at the Ritz. They danced at private parties until dawn. They sought out companionship, romantic, physical, emotional, with an urgency that only proximity to death can produce. Edward fit into this world perfectly. He was young, handsome, a prince, and desperately lonely. And it was in this world, in April 1917, at the Hôtel de Crillon, one of the most prestigious addresses in all of Paris, just steps from the Place de la Concorde, that the 22-year-old Prince of Wales met a woman who would become the first in a long line of forbidden lovers. Her name was Marguerite Alibert. She was 27 years old, stunningly beautiful, witty, sophisticated, impeccably dressed. She moved through Parisian high society with the ease of someone who had been born into it. But she had not been born into it. Marguerite Alibert had been born into poverty so grinding that it makes her later life seem like something from a novel. Born on December 9, 1890, in Paris, Marguerite was the daughter of a coachman and a housekeeper. Her childhood was marked by violence, neglect, and deprivation. Her younger brother died in a street accident, and her parents blamed her. At 16, she gave birth to a daughter, Raymonde, whose father she never named. The baby was sent away to relatives in the provinces. Marguerite was left with nothing, no money, no family support, no future. She found one through the only currency available to a beautiful, desperate young woman in early 20th century Paris: her ability to captivate powerful men. She entered the world of the demi-monde, the shadowy social territory between respectable society and outright prostitution. Under the guidance of Madame de Nantes, who ran one of Paris's most exclusive brothels catering to aristocrats and diplomats, Marguerite transformed herself. She learned how to dress, how to speak, how to make a wealthy man feel like the center of the universe. She became, in the language of the time, a courtesan, and one of the most sought-after women in Paris. By the time she met Edward, she had already been the mistress of André Mella, a wealthy Parisian businessman who bought her an apartment for their private meetings. She was experienced, confident, and ruthlessly strategic. Edward, by contrast, was none of these things. According to historian Andrew Rose, the meeting at the Crillon had been essentially arranged by Edward's friends, a gift to the young prince who was, at 22, still remarkably naive about women. The affair ignited instantly. For the next 13 months, Edward and Marguerite conducted a passionate secret relationship. He was infatuated. She was fascinating. And he made a catastrophic mistake that would echo through the decades. He wrote her letters. Not careful, diplomatic, royal letters, personal letters. Deeply intimate, shockingly candid letters. The kind of letters that a future king should never, under any circumstances, commit to paper. More than 20 of them. Letters that described his feelings, his desires, his private thoughts, in detail that would have scandalized the British public and humiliated the monarchy on a global stage. Marguerite kept every single one. When Edward ended the affair in 1918, his attention already wandering toward a new obsession, Marguerite let him know, in her own subtle way, that his letters were in her possession. The implicit threat hung in the air like smoke. She didn't need to say the words. Edward understood. He moved on. But Marguerite's story was far from over. In fact, the most dramatic chapter of her life, a chapter that would entangle the British crown in a murder scandal, was still 5 years away. 5 years later, inside London's most famous hotel, 3 gunshots would ring out at 2 in the morning, and the woman standing over the body, holding the pistol, would be the same woman who held the prince's most intimate secrets in a locked drawer. On the evening of July 9, 1923, Marguerite Alibert, now known as Madame Farmy, attended a performance of The Merry Widow at a London theatre with her husband, Ali Kamel Farmy Bey. He was fabulously wealthy, an Egyptian aristocrat with vast landholdings and a taste for luxury. He was also, by all accounts, violent, controlling, and sadistic. The marriage, which had taken place just over a year earlier, was a catastrophe. The couple fought so viciously and so publicly that they had earned a nickname among the staff of the various grand hotels they frequented, the Fighting Fammies. Ali had reportedly revoked a clause in their marriage contract that would have allowed Marguerite to seek a divorce. She was trapped, legally, financially, and physically. They returned from the theatre to their luxury suite on the 4th floor of the Savoy Hotel. The argument continued. At one point during a late supper in the hotel restaurant, Marguerite brandished a wine bottle and threatened to smash it over his head. Staff watched but did not intervene. The couple moved to the ballroom. Marguerite left around 1 a.m. Ali remained brooding. He returned to the suite around 2 a.m. Marguerite was still awake, wearing her satin evening dress, writing letters at the desk. Another argument erupted. Ali, in distress, stumbled into the corridor wearing his white silk nightgown, his face covered in scratches. He encountered the night porter, John Paul Beatty. After a moment, Ali turned and went back into the room. 3 gunshots rang out in rapid succession. When Beatty reached the suite, Ali Fahmy lay on the floor, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. Marguerite stood over him, holding a .32 Browning semi-automatic pistol. Outside, a violent thunderstorm shook the hotel windows. Ali was rushed to hospital. He died of his injuries. Marguerite was arrested on the spot. The case seemed utterly straightforward. She had been found holding the gun. There were witnesses. There was a clear history of violent arguments. A conviction, and, in 1923, almost certainly a hanging, seemed inevitable. But then something extraordinary happened. At her trial at the Old Bailey in September 1923, Marguerite Fahmy was acquitted, completely. The jury deliberated for barely an hour before returning their verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The public was stunned. How had a woman caught holding a smoking gun over her dead husband walked free? The official answer was self-defense. Her barrister, the legendary Sir Edward Marshall Hall, painted a devastating portrait of Ali Fahmy as a violent, sexually deviant monster who had terrorized his wife throughout their marriage. Marguerite, he argued, had fired in fear for her life. But many historians believe there was another factor, one that was never spoken aloud in court. Marguerite still possessed those intimate letters from the Prince of Wales, more than 20 of them. Letters so compromising that their publication could have destroyed not just Edward's reputation, but the credibility of the entire royal family. Historians, including Andrew Rose, have argued that the British establishment, possibly with the involvement of the palace itself, intervened behind the scenes to ensure Marguerite's acquittal. The price of keeping those letters secret was letting a murderer walk free. It has never been conclusively proven, but the circumstantial evidence, the speed of the verdict, the lenient treatment, the fact that Marguerite's royal connection was never mentioned during the trial, has led many historians to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Marguerite Alibert lived for nearly 50 more years. She died on January 2, 1971, at the age of 80. The letters from Edward were never published during her lifetime. And the man who had written them, by the time of her trial, he was already deep into his next obsession, a relationship that would last 16 years and produce thousands more letters. Rewind to March 1918, London. German Zeppelin raids had become a terrifying fact of life for Londoners. The massive airships drifted over the city at night, dropping bombs on civilian neighborhoods. When the air raid siren sounded, people ran for shelter, into basements, cellars, underground stations, anywhere below ground level. On one particular evening, a young woman named Freda Dudley Ward, petite, elegant, dark-haired, and widely considered one of the most attractive women in London society, found herself caught in the chaos while walking through Belgrave Square with a male companion. Through an open doorway, they could see a party in full swing inside one of the grand houses. As the sirens wailed and maroons, warning fireworks exploded overhead, the hostess spotted Freda and called out, inviting her and her friend to take shelter in the cellar. The hostess's name was Maud Kerr Smiley. And here is one of history's most extraordinary coincidences. Maud Kerr Smiley was the sister of Ernest Simpson. The same Ernest Simpson who was at that moment married to a woman named Wallis. The same Wallis Simpson who would, 16 years later, bring the British monarchy to the most dramatic crisis in its modern history. But tonight, in March 1918, none of that has happened yet. Tonight, in the darkness of the cellar as German bombs fall on London, a young man strikes up a conversation with Freda. He asks where she lives. She asks the same. He says he lives in London, sometimes in Windsor. She has no idea who he is. When the all-clear finally sounds and the party resumes upstairs, the hostess approaches Freda with a knowing smile. His Royal Highness is so anxious that you should stay and join us. His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, Edward. They danced together for the rest of the evening. Freda's male companion quietly disappeared into the night. By the early hours of the morning, the Prince of Wales personally escorted Freda home. The next day, he called upon her at her house. He wanted to see her again. He would see her almost every day for the next 16 years. Freda was married to William Dudley Ward, a Liberal Member of Parliament. They had 2 young daughters, Penelope, born in 1914, and Claire, born in 1916. The marriage was already unhappy, and William largely turned a blind eye to his wife's affair with the prince, as long as discretion was maintained. They eventually divorced in 1931. Edward's devotion to Freda was all-consuming. He called her every morning without fail, a ritual so predictable that her household staff nicknamed it the baker's call. He signed his letters "Tons and Tons of Love from Your E" and addressed her as "My Angel." He adored her daughters, who called him Little Prince. When royal tours took him to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and across the British Empire, he wrote to her obsessively, sometimes several letters in a single day. Over the course of their relationship, he produced more than 2,000 letters. Some historians estimate the total may have exceeded 4,000. But the letters reveal something that the public never saw. The dashing, confident, impossibly glamorous Prince of Wales, the man whose photograph appeared in newspapers around the world, the man dubbed the world's most eligible bachelor, was, in private, needy, insecure, and emotionally fragile. His letters to Freda are filled with self-loathing, complaints about his royal duties, and a desperate, almost childlike need for reassurance. He wrote like a frightened boy, not like a future king. Freda understood him. She was patient, steady, calming. She listened without judgment. She never demanded more than he could give. She knew with absolute clarity that they could never marry. She was a married woman, and even after her divorce, the idea of the Prince of Wales marrying a divorcee was socially and constitutionally impossible. She accepted the boundaries. She played by the rules. But what Freda didn't anticipate was that Edward would eventually find someone who didn't play by any rules at all. And ironically, that someone would be introduced to him by the woman who replaced Freda first. The woman who would destroy Freda's world didn't come from England. She came from America. She was glamorous, reckless, and connected to one of the most famous families in the United States. Her twin sister married a Vanderbilt, and she made one fatal mistake. She introduced the prince to her friend. Her name was Thelma Morgan. Born on August 23, 1904, at the Grand Hotel National in Lucerne, Switzerland, she entered the world alongside her identical twin sister, Gloria. Their father, Harry Hayes Morgan Sr., was an American diplomat who served as U.S. consul in Buenos Aires and Brussels. Their mother, Laura Delphine Kilpatrick, was a volatile, controlling woman with an obsession with aristocratic bloodlines and social status. Her own father, Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, had been a Union Army general and an American ambassador to Chile. The Morgan twins were raised on ambition and appearances. They were taught from early childhood that beauty was currency, that marrying wealthy was not merely desirable but essential, and that sentiment was a luxury reserved for people who could afford it. Love was secondary, position was everything, and the twins delivered spectacularly. Gloria Morgan married Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, connecting herself to one of the richest dynasties in American history. They had one daughter, Gloria Vanderbilt, who would grow up to become a legendary fashion designer and socialite, and whose son, Anderson Cooper, would become one of the most recognized news anchors in the world. Thelma's path was different but equally dramatic. At just 17, she married James Vale Converse in what she later called a youthful mistake. The marriage lasted barely 2 years before ending in divorce. After the split, she was rumored to be romantically linked to American actor Richard Bennett, a major matinee idol of the era and the father of Hollywood stars Constance Bennett and Joan Bennett. Thelma even dabbled in the film industry herself, founding a short-lived production company called Thelma Morgan Pictures at the age of 17 and briefly attempting acting. Hollywood touched her early. America was in her blood. But Thelma's ambitions were larger than California. In 1926, she married Marmaduke Furness, 1st Viscount Furness, a fabulously wealthy British shipping magnate. The marriage gave her a title, Viscountess Furness. It also gave her entry into the highest circles of British aristocratic society. And it was through this world, the world of country house weekends, hunting parties and royal gatherings, that she met the Prince of Wales. Their affair began around 1929. Edward was drawn to Thelma's warmth, her humour, her American energy and directness. She was everything the stiff, formal British aristocracy was not: relaxed, fun, openly affectionate. They exchanged small teddy bears as love tokens, a gesture that seems almost heartbreakingly innocent given what would follow. When they travelled apart, each carried the other's bear. It was their private ritual, their shared secret. For Freda Dudley Ward, the shift was unmistakable. Edward's morning calls became less frequent, his letters slowed. By 1929, Thelma had effectively replaced Freda as the primary woman in Edward's life. And the way Freda learned it was over, truly, finally over, was as brutal as anything in the history of royal relationships. According to multiple accounts, when Edward cut Freda off completely in 1934, she attempted to call him through the palace switchboard. The operator told her in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, "I have orders not to put you through. 16 years. Thousands of letters. A relationship that had defined both their lives. And it ended with a telephone operator following instructions. No goodbye, no explanation, no final conversation. Just silence. Freda Dudley Ward never publicly spoke against Edward, not once. She remarried in 1937 to Pedro Monet's Marquess of Casa Mori and lived a quiet life until her death in 1983 at the age of 88. She carried the pain with extraordinary dignity, a dignity that Edward, for all his royal titles, never managed to match. In early 1934, Thelma Furness needed to travel to the United States. Her twin sister Gloria was embroiled in a vicious, highly publicized custody battle with the Vanderbilt family over Gloria's 10-year-old daughter. Thelma, fiercely loyal to her twin, decided to cross the Atlantic to offer support. Before leaving England, she turned to a friend, a fellow American woman who had been steadily climbing through the prince's social circle. "I'm afraid the prince is going to be lonely," Thelma reportedly said. "Won't you look after him for me while I'm away?" The friend's name was Wallis Simpson, and that single request, casual, well-meaning, utterly naive, may have been the most catastrophic social favour in the history of the British monarchy. When Thelma returned from America several weeks later, everything had changed. Edward was cold, distant, polite but unreachable. His eyes didn't find hers across the room anymore. During a dinner party at Fort Belvedere, Edward's beloved country retreat near Windsor, Thelma watched, with growing horror, as Edward and Wallis exchanged glances that spoke of a shared intimacy far deeper than friendship. At one point during the meal, Wallis playfully slapped Edward's hand when he reached for something on the table. It was a tiny gesture, the kind of casual, possessive familiarity that only exists between lovers. Thelma understood instantly. She had lost him. She had asked her friend to look after the prince, and her friend had taken him. The rejection devastated Thelma. She threw herself into a brief, retaliatory affair with Prince Ali Khan, the glamorous Pakistani diplomat and socialite known for his own legendary romantic conquests. The affair was widely reported in the British and American press, confirming to Edward that his relationship with Thelma was finished. And then Thelma did something extraordinary. When she learned that Edward intended to marry Wallis, she took the three-seater sofa on which she, Edward, and Wallis had once sat together at Thelma's home, and she destroyed it. Physically, she cut it apart, sliced the three-seater down to a two-seater, removing the place where Wallis had sat. It was a small, private act of violence, furniture as revenge, but it spoke volumes about the fury and heartbreak that Edward left in his wake. That mutilated sofa eventually went to auction decades later, a silent monument to betrayal. Thelma spent the rest of her life between London and New York, eventually living with her twin sister Gloria. She died on January 29, 1970, in Manhattan at the age of 65. When her belongings were sorted through, they found something in her purse. A small, worn teddy bear, the one Edward had given her. She had carried it with her every single day for decades. Wallis Simpson's conquest of Edward was swift, total, and unlike anything the British monarchy had ever experienced. She was born Bessie Wallace Warfield on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense. She was not wealthy. She was not from a distinguished family. But she possessed something that Edward had never encountered before, an absolute, unshakable confidence in herself and a refusal, a flat, unapologetic refusal, to be impressed by his title. She had been married twice, first to Navy pilot Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr. in 1916, a marriage that ended in divorce in 1927. Then to Ernest Aldrich Simpson, an American-born British businessman, in 1928. She was introduced to Edward on January 10, 1931, by Thelma Furness herself at a weekend gathering at Borough Court near Melton Mowbray. Wallis had a terrible cold. She felt awful. She was convinced she would make a dreadful impression. She made the opposite. Edward was intrigued, then fascinated, then obsessed. By 1934, he was showering her with jewellery worth over £110,000, an astronomical sum in Depression-era Britain, equivalent to millions today. His obsession with Wallis was so alarming, so visibly reckless, that his own father, King George V, took the extraordinary step of ordering Scotland Yard's special branch to place his eldest son under active surveillance. Agents followed Edward, monitored his phone calls, tracked his movements, and filed reports that made devastating reading. The prince left confidential government documents, red boxes containing state secrets, lying around unsecured at Fort Belvedere. He discussed sensitive matters openly in front of guests at dinner parties. He was, in the eyes of the intelligence services, not merely an embarrassment but a genuine threat to national security. George V, who had watched his son's behaviour with mounting despair, reportedly told a courtier toward the end of his life, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. George V died on January 20, 1936. Edward ascended to the throne as King Edward V at the age of 41. His reign lasted exactly 326 days. The new king had made his choice. But the British public knew nothing, because every newspaper editor in the country had agreed to keep the scandal hidden. That wall of silence was about to come crashing down. Throughout most of 1936, the British public remained completely unaware that their new king was in an intimate relationship with a twice-divorced American woman. The British press, bound by a voluntary gentleman's agreement, maintained an extraordinary wall of silence. American and European newspapers, under no such obligation, splashed the story across their front pages for months. The bizarre result was that the entire world knew about the king's affair, except his own subjects. The silence broke on December 1, 1936. Alfred Blunt, the Bishop of Bradford, speaking at a diocesan conference about the upcoming coronation, made a pointed remark that the king should show greater awareness of his duties as head of the Church of England. The Yorkshire Post seized on the comment, connecting it explicitly to the king's relationship with Mrs. Simpson. Within hours, every newspaper in Britain followed suit. The self-imposed censorship collapsed overnight, and the scandal that had been burning across the Atlantic for months finally reached the British public. The reaction was seismic. The King of England, the head of the Church of England, which did not recognize divorce, wanted to marry a woman who had already divorced 2 living husbands. The constitutional implications were staggering. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin met with Edward repeatedly. The message was delivered with the politeness of British diplomacy and the weight of an ultimatum. Marry Wallis Simpson, and the entire cabinet would resign. The governments of the Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, were consulted. Their response was unanimous. The marriage was unacceptable. Edward was presented with 3 options. First, give up Wallis Simpson entirely. Second, marry her against the wishes of the government, triggering an unprecedented constitutional crisis that could bring down the monarchy itself. Third, abdicate the throne. He chose Wallis, he chose love, or what he believed was love, or perhaps he chose freedom. Perhaps, after a lifetime of suffocating duty and emotional deprivation, the abdication was not really about Wallis at all. Perhaps it was about escape. On December 10, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, Edward V signed the instrument of abdication. His 3 younger brothers, Albert, Duke of York, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Kent, stood as witnesses. The following day, Parliament enacted His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act, making it law. That evening, from Windsor Castle, Edward addressed the nation by radio. The BBC broadcast his words to millions. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." It was over. The shortest reign since Lady Jane Grey in the 16th century. 326 days on the throne, and then silence. His younger brother Bertie, shy, stammering, completely unprepared, became King George VI. The crown that Edward had discarded would eventually pass to Bertie's daughter, a young princess named Elizabeth, who would become the longest reigning monarch in British history. Edward left Britain the very next day, sailing for Austria. He married Wallis in France on June 3, 1937. He was given the title Duke of Windsor. Wallis became the Duchess of Windsor, but the royal family deliberately denied her the title Her Royal Highness, a calculated snub that Edward resented bitterly until his dying day. After the abdication, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor became arguably the most famous couple on the planet, and the most purposeless. They settled primarily in Paris in an opulent mansion at the edge of the Bois de Boulogne. They traveled constantly: New York, Palm Beach, the French Riviera, and crucially, Hollywood. They hosted lavish dinner parties with elaborate place settings and rigid social protocols, maintaining the rituals of a royalty that no longer existed. Wallis became a fashion icon, her name synonymous with chic elegance. The Duke became a man searching for a role that would never come. During World War II, Edward served briefly and controversially as governor of the Bahamas, a remote posting widely understood as the British government's way of keeping the Duke as far from Europe as possible. The reason was not just his uselessness, it was his politics. In October 1937, barely 4 months after their wedding, the Duke and Duchess had made an ill-advised visit to Nazi Germany, during which they met Adolf Hitler himself. Photographs from that trip: the former King of England shaking hands with the Führer, the Duchess smiling warmly in the presence of senior Nazi officials, would haunt them for the rest of their lives and permanently tarnish whatever remained of their public reputation. But it was the couple's connection to Hollywood, the secret, scandalous, after dark Hollywood, that added the most provocative chapter to their post-abdication story. The Windsors moved in celebrity circles with ease, connected to Hollywood's elite through figures like Cecil Beaton, the celebrated British photographer who operated as a bridge between Buckingham Palace and Beverly Hills. Through Beaton and various English actors working in California, the Duke and Duchess found themselves welcomed into the film industry's most glamorous drawing rooms. And according to one extraordinary and deeply controversial source, their Hollywood life went far beyond cocktail parties and premieres. Scotty Bowers was a former Marine who arrived in Hollywood in 1946, and from a gas station on Hollywood Boulevard, quietly built what can only be described as a sexual matchmaking service for the entertainment industry's biggest names. For nearly 4 decades, Bowers allegedly arranged private, discreet encounters for actors, directors, and celebrities who needed to keep their desires hidden from the public eye. In his 2012 memoir, Full Service: My Adventures in Hollywood and the Secret Sex Lives of the Stars, a book endorsed by the writer Gore Vidal, who personally vouched for its accuracy, Bowers made a claim that shocked even Hollywood's most jaded observers. He stated that he had personally arranged sexual partners for the Duke and Duchess of Windsor during their visits to California. According to Bowers, the couple had been recommended to him by Cecil Beaton and other English acquaintances. The encounters were arranged discreetly. The participants, Bowers claimed, were told only that they were meeting a wealthy couple from England. These are, it must be emphasized, unverified claims from a single source. Many historians treat Bowers's accounts with significant skepticism, and the Duke and Duchess are obviously unable to confirm or deny them. However, director Matt Tiernauer, who made the acclaimed 2017 documentary Scotty and the Secret History of Hollywood, noted that independent research confirmed the Windsors were in Los Angeles at precisely the times Bowers described. And Bowers's other claims about Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, and others have been at least partially corroborated by independent biographers and journalists over the years. What is beyond any dispute is this: after the abdication, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor lived a life of extraordinary social excess. They were fixtures on the international celebrity circuit, rubbing shoulders with movie stars, fashion designers, and socialites on 3 continents. They were photographed constantly, gossiped about relentlessly, and invited everywhere. And yet beneath the glamour there was a profound emptiness. The Duke had no official role, no responsibilities, no meaningful work. The British government wanted nothing to do with him. His own family treated him with a coolness that bordered on hostility. And Wallis denied the HRH title she believed she deserved, carried a permanent, grinding sense of grievance that coloured everything. Alice Keppel, the longtime mistress of Edward's grandfather King Edward VII, captured the absurdity perfectly. When she heard about the abdication, she reportedly said, "Things were done much better in my day." The irony? Keppel's great-granddaughter was Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman who would eventually marry Prince Charles, creating yet another chapter in the endless cycle of royal scandal and forbidden love. The decades that followed the abdication were a slow, grinding lesson in irrelevance. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor lived in Paris, but they belonged nowhere. Britain didn't want them. The royal family kept Edward at arm's length, and the government blocked every attempt he made to secure a meaningful diplomatic or public role. France was simply a place to live, not a home. And America, the country Edward had idolized his entire life, welcomed them as celebrities, but never as citizens. They visited New York regularly, staying in luxury hotels, attending glittering parties, and being photographed endlessly. But the photographs, over time, began to tell a sadder story. Two people growing older, growing smaller, with nothing left to do but dress up and go out. The couple's finances added another layer of bitterness. After the abdication, Edward had lied to his brother, the new King George VI, about how much money he had. George VI was forced to borrow money to purchase Balmoral and Sandringham, the royal family estates that Edward technically still owned. The financial dishonesty deepened the family rift and ensured that Edward would never be fully welcomed back. Their social world, once so dazzling, gradually contracted. Friends who had been fascinated by the Windsors in the 1930s and 1940s grew bored of them by the 1950s and 1960s. Visitors to the Paris mansion described a household frozen in time, elaborately formal dinners for dwindling guest lists, conversations that circled endlessly around the same grievances, and an atmosphere of luxurious sadness that even the most expensive champagne couldn't wash away. The Duchess ran the household with military precision. The Duke puttered around the garden, played golf, and walked their beloved pug dogs. They had no children. They had no legacy beyond the scandal itself. The evidence also suggested that neither partner was particularly faithful. Declassified documents revealed years later showed that Wallis was reportedly having her own affairs even while Edward was courting her, and that the pattern may have continued after their marriage. The great love story of the century, it turned out, may have been more performance than passion. By the late 1960s, the Duke of Windsor's health was in steep decline. He was diagnosed with throat cancer, the result of decades of heavy smoking. The glamorous couple who had once set the social world ablaze were now two elderly people rattling around a Parisian mansion, surrounded by servants and small dogs, clinging to the rituals of a life that no longer had any meaning. Queen Elizabeth II visited her uncle in Paris in May 1972 during a state visit to France. Edward was too ill to leave his first-floor sitting room, but with enormous effort, he managed to rise from his chair and bow to his niece, the woman who wore the crown that he had thrown away 36 years earlier. He died 10 days later, on May 28, 1972, at the age of 77. His body was returned to England and buried at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle. His night nurse during those final weeks, Baltimore-born Juliana Chattard Alexander, later shared a detail that casts a long, cold shadow over the supposed love story of the century. She hardly ever came in to see him. Alexander told the Baltimore Sun, speaking of the Duchess, "I saw her in his room on the first night, and then again the night he died. I was there from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. for about 3 weeks, and during that time she didn't come in." Biographer Andrew Lowney went further. He noted that even before their marriage, Wallis had privately confided to friends that she found Edward boring and didn't want to be left alone with him. She felt trapped by his obsession, trapped by the enormity of what he had sacrificed, trapped by the impossibility of ever leaving a man who had surrendered a throne for her. Edward himself, according to those who knew him in his final years, was consumed by regret. Not regret for loving Wallis, but regret for everything the love had cost him: his country, his family, his purpose. He spent his last decades as a man with a royal title and absolutely nothing to do with it. A king without a kingdom. A husband whose wife didn't visit his deathbed. Wallis survived him by 14 years. Her health declined steadily. She became increasingly isolated in the Paris mansion, cared for by a diminishing staff, visited by fewer and fewer friends. Her memory deteriorated. The sharp, witty, fearless woman who had captivated a king faded into a fragile shell. She died on April 24, 1986, at the age of 89. She was buried beside Edward at Frogmore. Step back from the individual stories and a devastating pattern reveals itself. A pattern that transforms this from a tale of royal scandal into something much more psychologically revealing. Marguerite Alibert, used, discarded, her silence bought with a murder acquittal. Freda Dudley Ward, adored obsessively for 16 years, then erased with a single instruction to a switchboard operator. No goodbye, no explanation, just the click of a disconnected line. Thelma Furness, replaced by her own friend, left clutching a teddy bear in her purse for the remaining 36 years of her life. Wallis Simpson, the woman who supposedly won but who spent her final years alone in a cavernous house, barely visited by the husband she had supposedly enchanted, and then left to die slowly and alone after he was gone. 4 women, 4 different countries of origin, 4 completely different personalities. And yet the ending was always the same: abandonment. Edward consumed women the way a fire consumes oxygen, intensely, desperately, and then he moved on, leaving nothing but ash behind him. He didn't do it out of cruelty. That's what makes the pattern so tragic. He did it because he was looking for something that no human being, no matter how beautiful, how patient, how devoted, could ever give him. He was looking for the unconditional love his parents never provided. And every time a woman came close to providing it, he found a reason to destroy what they had built. Every woman who entered Edward's life was transformed by the experience. Most were damaged by it. And the thread that connects them all, the detail that elevates this beyond gossip into genuine historical significance, is that nearly every one of them had deep American connections. Marguerite's clients included wealthy Americans. Freda's mother was American. Thelma and Gloria Morgan were American-born, with family connections stretching from the Vanderbilt mansions of New York to the movie studios of Hollywood. And Wallis was as thoroughly American as Baltimore crab cakes and the 4th of July. Edward didn't just fall in love with individual women. He fell in love with America itself, with its energy, its informality, its brash rejection of the suffocating class hierarchy that had imprisoned him since birth. As he wrote in his own memoirs, "America meant to me a country in which nothing is impossible." He loved jazz. He chewed gum, openly, publicly, scandalously, for a royal. He drove a custom-built American Buick. He surfed in Hawaii. He danced with American shopgirls in the Panama Canal Zone. He partied with New York's most glamorous socialites on Long Island. During his 1924 visit to New York, he devoted himself entirely to polo, parties, jazz clubs, and dancing, cementing his reputation as the ultimate Playboy prince and the world's most eligible bachelor. Britain represented duty, rigidity, and a father who never said he was proud. America represented freedom, warmth, and the intoxicating possibility that David, just David, not the Prince of Wales, could be loved for who he actually was. He was wrong, of course. The women who loved him didn't love just David. They loved the prince, the power, the glamour, the impossible proximity to the throne. And when the throne was gone, what was left? A small, lonely man in a Paris mansion, watching the world through a window, a prince who wanted to be free, a courtesan who kept his secrets and got away with murder, a devoted mistress abandoned by a telephone operator, a glamorous American twin who made the most catastrophic introduction in royal history, and the woman who took the crown, only to discover that winning can be its own kind of prison. Edward Fife's trail of American love affairs didn't just break hearts. It broke the monarchy. It rewrote the line of succession. It put Elizabeth II on the throne. And it proved, once and for all, that even the most powerful man in the British Empire could be brought to his knees by the one thing his title could never buy him: the simple, devastating feeling of being loved. And that is the story of the British king who loved American women. A story of obsession, betrayal, and forbidden desire that changed the monarchy forever. If this story kept you watching, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. We've got more royal scandals coming that are even more shocking than this one. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Edward truly loved these women, or was he just addicted to the thrill of breaking the rules? I read every single comment. Until next time, this has been Pure British Scandals.